Romans chapter 8. I was in a Christian bookstore this week, and I was just perusing bookshelf. They had a sale going on over here. What's it called? The Morning Star. And so anyway, I was in there, and it's one of those suddenly moments that I was talking to you about just a little bit earlier. It happened to me. I was reading like the forward to a book, and I think it was called something like 5 Things That You Need to Avoid, 5 Things That'll Help You Destroy Your Ministry. And so it had a picture of a hand on there, 5 things, and it caught my attention. And so I picked it up, and I was just wanted to see what are the 5 things, what's in the book of, or the table of contents. And so I was reading that, and then I got into the introduction. And it got my attention because it was telling a story about this pastor, Pastor Jonathan. And right away I saw that he was a pastor in New England. And so I started reading Pastor Jonathan, the story that this author was telling about Pastor Jonathan in New England. He pastored a church, and he'd been pastoring a church for many, many years, but he never was really the greatest pastor in the world as far as just being very pastoral. He was a good preacher, a good teacher, but he wasn't very pastoral. And so a lot of times he ran into trouble in the local church with people saying that he wasn't a good pastor. And this got my attention right away. You can see why. And so I was into this, and I was thinking, okay, Pastor Jonathan's got my attention. What's going to happen to Pastor Jonathan? Pastor Jonathan's in New England. What's going to happen to Pastor Jonathan? What's New England been like to Pastor Jonathan? Just maybe there's some warnings in there for me, or some tips of advice, or whatever. So I was reading about Pastor Jonathan, and Pastor Jonathan got along well for a long time because he had another assistant in his church who was very pastoral. I don't think he was even an assistant. I think he was just a member of the congregation that was a very pastoral guy. He would check in on people. He would always be there for people. He was the kind of guy that enjoyed talking to people. And so he took up the slack for Pastor Jonathan. And so a few things would happen, a few critical issues cropped up over the years, and somehow the church would skirt, and Pastor Jonathan would skirt the issue, and everything would be okay, and the church would calm down again. But eventually this man in his church passed away. And, the devil's like this, right? He used the opportunity to bring a little bit of a schism, a disagreement into that church body. And so something arose. I think it was about the matter of some people being members in that church who were not saved. The previous pastor, I think, had allowed people to be, members on the roll, but they weren't saved. And a few of these people from Pastor Jonathan's church had fallen into sin. It became quite public. And so he, as a pastor, felt like he needed to do something. He needed to say something. He needed to disassociate the church and Christ from the actions of these members in his church. But he was a little bit hesitant because of his history. And he didn't have brother so-and-so there to help him, to bail him out, to have the talks that probably would need to be had. And so, long story short, it really blew up in that church here in New England. And it really blew up for Pastor Jonathan. And at 46 years old, they fired him. And he was a man really with nowhere to go. I don't think he had anything else that he could do. I think he did have some cows. But the division in his church became so bad that the people in the town wouldn't even let him graze his cows on land in that area. And I was thinking, man, well, this is really not all that surprising. I've been a pastor for a long time. These things can happen. But when it gets to that point, it's really bad. How many people would agree it's really bad? And but they said Pastor Jonathan never let on like anything really was all that wrong. He just continued to be a nice guy, continued to be a friendly guy, continued to put a smile on his face, even when he didn't feel like it, took his cows somewhere else, did whatever. And in the process of time, 15 years later, the people that caused the dissension in that church actually came back to Pastor Jonathan and said that we're very sorry. It was not you. It was us. It was our jealousy. It was our pride. In fact, it was our pride that has allowed it to be 15 years before we've come back to you and asked your forgiveness and talked to you. And so when you paint the picture up to that point, you're like, man, bad things can happen in the church, can't they? And people can get into such predicaments, and there can be such a disunity in the body. We've been talking about the unity of the body, how the body of Christ is one of those images that the Apostle Paul painted for us. It's important to be a body because that's where our strength is. We are in unity with Christ, but if we're in unity with Christ, it also means that we have to be unified together because we are all members of Christ. I can't say I love God and not love my brother and my sister. And so it's so important. And this story just got my attention because this is what we're talking about. A church that's not acting like a body, that's not really being the body of Christ, will always get into these kinds of situations. And if it doesn't get into this situation, like the one we're describing with Pastor Jonathan, it'll find its way into a myriad of other negative situations. Or if it doesn't get into negative situations, a lot of the time, the churches will just, they will just kind of, over time, settle into a more natural lifestyle than the spiritual lifestyle that they've been called to. So I was thinking about poor old Pastor Jonathan there, man. I wonder what happened to him. How many people know what happened to him? I mean, most of us would guess, that that's really a bum rap. He had no other church to pastor, nowhere else to go, right? He's 46 years old. What's the guy going to do? But I tell you, God is so good. You can't always judge a book by its cover. You can't always judge the outcome of a story by the story itself. Because at the end of that story I read, this Jonathan, Pastor Jonathan, turned out to be Jonathan Edwards. And so all the trouble, all the heartbreak, all the things that he went through, and all the things that he would have learned by going through those things, even though God didn't design it. God never designs a schism in the body. Paul teaches us this. He never designs for there to be division. He has designed that we would be one body living out of one spirit. But God sure uses things. God sure uses things. Man, New England will never be the same as far as history records because of Jonathan Edwards. He went on to become one of the greatest revivalists in the history of this nation. One of the greatest revivals, the Great Awakening is one of the greatest revivals in the history of America. And it all happened after Jonathan was Pastor Jonathan. After Pastor Jonathan got kicked around in his church somewhere around here in New England. God uses things to do a work. And God used really that negative, divisive spirit that was in his local church to bring such a harmony and a unity to the body of Christ in this nation. Man, that's what I'm looking for. How about you? That's what I'm doing here. That's what I'm believing for. I was relating to that story. Man, I've been through some church, situations, some pastoral jobs that were difficult like that. And you can either do one of two things. Maybe you've been through some negative situations as a believer. You can do one of things. You can either get bitter or get better, as the old saying goes. You can either sit and wallow around in what you haven't had or somebody hasn't done, or you can just turn yourself back to Jesus and say, Lord, I thank you that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I'm not going to let it get me down. I'm going to cause it to refuel me, energize me, strengthen me, Lord. Thank you for a spirit of wisdom, Father, and revelation. Thank you for a spirit of counsel and a spirit of might and strength, Father. You do what you want to do. You do in my life what you want to do. You do in your church, Lord, what you want to do. And that's where we need to come to. That's where the Lord is bringing us to in this hour. That's why we don't just, come here to have a service. We're here to worship. We're here, man, to hear from God. We're here for the church to express the life of God, express the gifts of God, right? Express that unity of God. That's what we're here for, because that's who we are.